By late 1944, the Southwest Pacific War had moved north and west of Borneo. American-led operations had retaken parts of the Netherlands East Indies and landed in the Philippines, while large Japanese garrisons across the region became increasingly isolated as Allied sea and air control reduced there to receive fuel, ammunition, and replacements in predictable quantities. In this setting, Borneo was both a strategic resource zone and a political problem. It contained major oil infrastructure at Tarakan and Balik Papan, and additional petroleum sites in northern Borneo. But it sat off the main axis of advance toward Japan that was being defined by the Philippines and plans for later operations. Within the Allied coalition, Operation Oboe emerged as a compromise between operational planning and alliance management. General Douglas MacArthur, as Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific area, developed Oboe as a sequence of amphibious assaults intended initially to open airfields and lodgements that could support a later landing on Java. That broader concept changed in spring 1945, when the planned Java operation was not authorized by the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff. Subsequent planning left only selected Oboe landings to proceed. For Australia, the campaign addressed multiple aims at once. 2 experienced Australian divisions, the 7th and 9th Divisions of the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, were available after earlier New Guinea operations, and Australian leaders sought a defined combat role in the final phase of the Pacific War. Dutch authorities in exile and Dutch-connected military elements also had strong interests in the restoration of control in the Netherlands East Indies. These political factors intersected with military rationales centered on oil facilities, ports, and airfields. Operationally, Oboe was planned and staged from Morotai in the Moluccas, which served as the primary Allied mounting and logistics area for the Borneo landings. From there, the timetable and force allocations linked 3 main objectives: Tarakan, Oboe 1, the Brunei Bay and Labuan area in British North Borneo, Oboe 6, and Balik Papan, Oboe 2. In the final executed sequence, Oboe 1 was scheduled for May 1, 1945, with the Australian 26th Brigade detached from the 9th Division. Oboe 6 was scheduled for June 10, 1945, with the remainder of the 9th Division, and Oboe 2 was scheduled for July 1, 1945, with the Australian 7th Division. The stated operational preconditions rested on a set of assumptions about what Borneo could provide. Tarakan was selected primarily for its airstrip, expected to support subsequent operations. Brunei Bay was intended to offer a sheltered anchorage and a base area, with Labuan's facilities and nearby oil fields factoring into post-landing priorities. Balik Papan combined port access with one of the most significant oil refining complexes in the region. Across the plan, airfield construction and repair units, naval mine sweeping, hydrographic survey work, and extensive amphibious lift were treated as enabling requirements rather than secondary support. The Japanese position on Borneo in 1945 reflected both local defensive preparation and strategic constraint. By late 1944, Japanese planners increasingly emphasized inland defensive positions rather than prolonged beach defense, anticipating that Allied naval gunfire and air bombardment would make the shoreline costly to hold. Japanese command arrangements on the island were reorganized to coordinate defense, but garrisons faced shortages in transport, heavy weapons, and air cover compared to earlier phases of the war, and they had limited capacity to shift forces rapidly once landings began. Civilian conditions formed another precondition that shaped the campaign's realities. Borneo's population had lived under Japanese occupation since early 1942, with local economies oriented toward forced extraction, restricted movement, and wartime scarcity. Allied planners expected that bombardment, fighting near towns and oil sites, and the disruption of food distribution would produce displacement and medical crises that landing forces would have to manage alongside combat tasks. In practice, the campaign's opening moves would place civilians, prisoners of war, and forced laborers in proximity to airstrikes, naval shelling, and rapid changes of control, creating outcomes that different participants interpreted through immediate survival needs rather than higher-level strategy. In March 1945, The first executed step of Operation Oboe was fixed on Tarakan Island off the northeast coast of Borneo. The landing force was built around the Australian 26th Infantry Brigade Group of the 9th Division, with attached engineers, artillery, and service units, and a small Dutch KNIL company intended to assist with local navigation and interpretation. The assault was mounted primarily from Morotai, where shipping, fuel, and ammunition stocks had been concentrated for a short, high-tempo campaign. The Japanese garrison on Tarakan was comparatively limited in numbers, but organized for a defense that assumed the coastline would be hit by heavy bombardment. The defending force is typically estimated at about 2,200 personnel, including the Imperial Japanese Army, 455th Independent Infantry Battalion, and supporting troops, alongside naval ground units, with defense coordinated under Major Tadao Tokoi. Coastal guns and prepared positions covered likely approaches, while the main defensive concept relied on inland strongpoints connected by tracks through mangroves, swamps, and low ridges. The opening phase began before the first wave went ashore. In April 1945, Allied aircraft struck Tarakan repeatedly to suppress gun positions, disrupt communications, and reduce the defenders' ability to concentrate against the landing beaches. Naval forces then moved in to clear mines and confirm channels. Survey and minesweeping work was treated as a prerequisite for landing large transports and for bringing in follow-on loads. Bulldozers, bridging equipment, road metal, fuel, and aviation engineering stores intended to restore the airstrip as quickly as conditions allowed. On 30 April, small parties moved close to the intended landing area to check tides, mark channels, and deal with obstacles. The main convoy, including Australian troop-carrying landing ships and U.S. amphibious elements, took station offshore under escort. Naval gunfire and airstrikes were coordinated to coincide with the final approach, aiming to keep defenders away from the shoreline while landing craft formed into waves. At first light on May 1, 1945, the assault went in on the western side of Tarakan near Lingkas. The initial landings established a beachhead with limited immediate resistance at the waterline, but the terrain imposed its own constraints. Narrow beaches, soft ground, and swampy flats restricted vehicle movement and forced traffic into a small number of usable exits. Infantry units pushed to secure key junctions that would allow engineers to bring in heavy equipment and begin roadwork toward the airfield. By the end of the first day, the Allied force had a functioning lodgment and was landing additional supplies, artillery, and vehicles. The next immediate objectives were set in practical terms: expand the perimeter beyond artillery range of the beaches, seize Tarakan town and the port facilities needed for continuous unloading, and open routes to the airfield so that repair work could start. For the defenders, the opening day confirmed the expected pattern. The shoreline could not be held without absorbing concentrated naval and air fire, so surviving units withdrew toward prepared inland positions to delay the advance and contest movement on the few passable tracks. The operation's opening thus produced two parallel realities. At sea and on the beaches, the Allies prioritized flow, landing schedules, traffic control, and the rapid buildup of logistics on shore. Inland, Japanese units focused on preserving combat power and channeling the attackers into terrain, where small numbers could impose time costs through ambushes, mines, and concealed firing points. The campaign's decisive questions, already visible in the first 48 hours, were less about whether a landing could be made, and more about how quickly an airfield and port could be made operational under fire, and what manpower both sides could sustain in close terrain before the next Oboe landings were due to follow. By March and April 1945, Operation Oboe had been narrowed from a multi-stage concept into three main assaults: Tarakan on May 1st, the Brunei Bay area on June 10th, and Balik Papan on July 1st. Earlier versions had linked Borneo to a subsequent landing on Java, with intermediate steps intended to secure additional bases on the east and south coasts of Borneo. When the Java concept was not pursued, the remaining Oboe operations were justified in more limited terms: seize selected ports and airfields, regain control of oil infrastructure, and create lodgements that could support fleet basing and later regional actions if ordered. The Allied command arrangement reflected the coalition nature of the campaign. Australian Front Corps under Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead provided the main ground force using the veteran 7th and 9th Divisions. Amphibious lift, mine-sweeping, and much of the naval gunfire support came from United States 7th Fleet forces, with additional Australian and Dutch warships in key roles. Air planning combined Royal Australian Air Force and United States Army Air Force's capabilities, with an explicit expectation that captured airfields would reduce reliance on long-range sorties from distant bases. The strategic goals differed by objective, and those differences shaped planning priorities. Tarakan was treated primarily as an airfield operation. The landing force, built around the Australian 26th Infantry Brigade Group, was ordered not only to defeat the garrison, but to deliver a working runway quickly enough to support the next landings. Planning assumptions set a short repair timetable, and engineer units were allocated accordingly, including VRAAF airfield construction squadrons and heavy equipment intended to fill bomb craters, stabilize soft ground, and lay steel landing mat where needed. The operational logic was straightforward. Without a functioning strip, fighter cover and tactical air support would remain dependent on bases outside Borneo. Oboe 6, centered on Brunei Bay, carried a different set of objectives. The main landing force was the Australian 9th Division with its 20th and 24th Brigades, reinforced by armor and extensive base units. The targets were the bay itself as an anchorage, Labuan Island as an administrative and airfield site, and coastal towns and oil areas on the mainland near Brunei. The plan treated port capacity, dumps, and road access as immediate operational requirements because the force was expected to sustain dispersed moves along the coast and river lines once ashore. Planners also had to reconcile competing expectations. Some Allied staffs viewed Brunei Bay as a potential fleet support area, while others questioned whether building facilities there would matter before the wider war ended. Oboe 2 at Balik Papan was planned as the largest single assault of the series and required the most extensive shaping actions. The Australian 7th Division, with the 18th, 21st, and 25th Infantry Brigades, was assigned an objective area that combined port facilities, oil installations, and nearby airfield sites. Japanese defenders in the Balik Papan area were assessed as fewer in number than the attackers, but supported by prepared positions, coastal batteries, and demolition plans for industrial sites. The Allied plan emphasized three linked prerequisites before the first wave: minesweeping to open safe lanes and anchorages, sustained air attacks to suppress gun positions and disrupt movement, and a prolonged naval bombardment schedule coordinated to cover the approach, the landing, and the first inland advances. Across all three operations, logistics planning was treated as a defining constraint. Morotai served as the main staging base, with shipping schedules written around tides, beach gradients, and the limited number of usable exits from swampy coastal flats. The landing forces required not only infantry and artillery lift, but bulldozers, bridging stores, fuel pipelines, medical facilities, and civil affairs detachments intended to manage prisoners, displaced civilians, and the re-establishment of local administration. The presence of Dutch East Indies personnel in several landings reflected that administrative objective as much as a tactical need. Intelligence and reconnaissance planning attempted to reduce uncertainty in terrain that limited observation. Small teams carried out close coastal reconnaissance ahead of landings, sometimes using folding boats and night movement to identify beach exits, obstacles, and Japanese positions. In parallel, Special Operations Australia inserted small parties into parts of Borneo from March 1945 onward to collect local information, build contact networks, and report on roads, river crossings, and garrison patterns. These efforts produced uneven detail, but they influenced choices about landing beaches, axes of advance, and the likely locations of inland defensive positions. The combined result was a campaign plan that assumed time would be saved through engineering and mobility. Seize a foothold, bring ashore construction capacity immediately, and convert captured ground into air and port functionality. The risks were also built into the plan. If an airfield repair schedule slipped, later operations would depend on longer-range air support. If minesweeping was delayed, the assault shipping timetable would compress. And if Japanese forces avoided decisive battle at the beaches, the campaign would shift into inland clearance actions that consume manpower and days the planners were trying to conserve. In early May 1945, the fighting on Tarakan shifted from the landing area to a sequence of inland engagements shaped by limited routes and prepared positions. Once the beachhead was secured and artillery was brought ashore, Australian infantry advanced toward Tarakan town and the airfield. The defenders, estimated at about 2,200, relied on small unit positions and covered approaches along tracks bordered by swamp, mangrove, and thick vegetation. Rather than attempting to hold open ground, Japanese units used concealment, mines, and mutually supporting firing points to slow movement and force repeated set-piece attacks. The first engagements after May first concentrated around the road network leading to the airfield and the elevated ground that overlooked key approaches. Australian units had to clear successive strongpoints that could not be bypassed easily because the terrain restricted flanking movement. Fire support became central. Infantry attacks were planned with artillery concentrations and, when observation allowed, close air support. Tanks and armored vehicles were present, but their use depended on engineers improving routes and bridging soft sections. So, infantry and combat engineers often led the advance together. Tarakan town and the immediate port area were secured during the first week, allowing unloading to increase and casualty evacuation to stabilize. However, the central operational goal on Tarakan was the airfield, and the airfield became an example of how combat and engineering constraints interacted. Japanese air attacks were limited in effect compared to 1942 to 1943 conditions, but the airfield itself was heavily damaged by pre-landing bombing and the ground conditions were poor. Large craters, drainage problems, and soft soil delayed repairs. The planned timetable for a quick return to service was not met, and this had practical consequences. Air support for subsequent operations remained dependent on aircraft operating from outside Borneo for longer than anticipated. As the Australians pushed inland, several defensive hills and ridgelines became focal points for close combat. These positions, often connected by trenches and bunkers, required deliberate assaults. The pattern repeated. Reconnaissance identified a position, artillery and mortars prepared the approach, engineers dealt with mines and obstacles, and infantry closed in to clear bunkers at short range. Japanese defenders aimed to impose delays and casualties by forcing attackers into narrow killing areas. Australian tactics emphasized controlled advances, maintaining supply lines back to the beachhead, and using concentrated firepower to reduce positions rather than trying to outmaneuver them in ground that limited visibility. By mid-May, the Japanese defense had compressed into interior pockets, and organized resistance was increasingly localized. The defending force, unable to replenish and with limited ability to relocate under constant pressure, shifted toward holding isolated strongpoints as long as possible. Australian forces continued systematic clearance operations, with patrols to locate remaining positions and coordinated assaults to eliminate them. The operation effectively became a sequence of small battles rather than a single decisive engagement. Civilian conditions on Tarakan were shaped by disruption rather than by large-scale urban combat. Many civilians had already dispersed or were forced into restricted areas under occupation policies before the landing. After Allied control expanded, priorities included restoring basic order, treating the wounded, and managing prisoners and captured supplies. The port and town also became hubs for labor and transport, and the return of Dutch administrative personnel introduced a new layer of authority that interacted with local communities in ways that varied by area and circumstance. By late June 1945, Australian forces declared Tarakan secured after weeks of fighting and clearance, but the operation's results were mixed relative to its initial objectives. The garrison had been eliminated and the island was in Allied hands, yet the airfield's delayed operational status reduced its immediate value for the wider Oboe sequence. The Tarakan experience influenced later planning by reinforcing a central lesson of the campaign. On Borneo, the tempo of operations was often governed less by the landing itself and more by engineering realities and the time required to reduce dispersed inland defenses. By early June 1945, the campaign expanded from Tarakan into northern Borneo, and the scale of forces increased. For the Brunei Bay landings, the Australian 9th Division deployed about 29,000 to 30,000 men, supported by United States amphibious shipping and specialist shore units. Japanese strength in the objective area was assessed by the Allies at about 8,800, organized under the Japanese 37th Army, with defense spread between coastal localities, river lines, and inland withdrawal routes rather than concentrated at a single beachhead. The opening of Oboe 6 on June 10th involved simultaneous assaults designed to seize a sheltered anchorage, establish port capacity, and secure airfield sites. Labuan Island was attacked by elements of the Australian 24th Brigade with Matilda tanks and strong naval gunfire support. On the mainland, other elements moved against Brunei town and adjacent coastal points. The operational pressure point immediately became logistics. Large stocks of fuel, engineering stores, and rations had to be landed quickly to sustain dispersed moves across an area with limited roads, extensive swamp ground, and transport dependence on rivers, coastal craft, and a small number of tracks. The crisis phase developed around the gap between rapid coastal seizure and the slower clearance of prepared positions inland. On Labuan, Japanese defenders withdrew into a fortified area that came to be treated by the attackers as a discreet strongpoint. A company-level attack on June 14th did not break the position, and the assault method shifted toward increased fire preparation. Between June 17th and 20th, the position was subjected to a concentrated naval and aerial bombardment, followed by a renewed ground attack on 21st June that completed the clearance of the main defended pocket. The fighting on Labuan produced measured losses on both sides. Australian casualties for the Labuan operations were 34 killed and 93 wounded, while 389 Japanese dead were counted and 11 prisoners were taken. At the same time, the mainland operations expanded the geography of contact. Brunei town was taken, and the Brunei Bay perimeter widened to protect unloading areas and enable the construction of base facilities. Japanese forces sought to disrupt this buildup through local attacks rather than large counterlandings. During the Labuan phase, about 100 Japanese raided the Australian maintenance area and the airfield, showing that even with the coastline controlled, small forces could still reach soft targets through cover and night movement. These actions did not reverse the lodgment, but they required additional security troops and slowed the transition from combat to base construction. The campaign then extended along the Clayas Peninsula and toward the Beaufort Rail and River Junction, which Japanese forces treated as an important line on their withdrawal routes. Australian movement combined barge traffic, small craft, and advance along the railway from Weston, with infantry battalions operating in separated columns that had to be supplied and reinforced over waterlogged ground. The Battle of Beaufort, fought from June 26th to 28th, brought the heaviest mainland resistance of Oboe 6. 2 Australian battalions attacked a Japanese force estimated at 800 to 1,000. Terrain and weather shaped the fight, including torrential downpours that affected movement and visibility. Australian casualties were 7 killed and 38 wounded. Japanese losses were assessed at about 93 killed and 2 captured. Across this phase, the campaign's escalation was defined less by a single continuous front and more by the requirement to secure multiple nodes at once: beaches, dumps, river crossings, rail points, and airstrips. Command decisions emphasized controlling tempo through firepower and engineering rather than rapid pursuit, partly because the operational objective included making Brunei Bay usable as a base area. In parallel, the broader strategic context intruded. By June 1945, Allied plans were already focused on final operations elsewhere, and the continued commitment of large amphibious resources to Borneo reflected a mix of military and political priorities. On the ground, however, the immediate crisis was practical: clearing inland positions without disrupting the supply system that kept the landing force functioning, while Japanese units attempted to trade space for time and preserve enough cohesion to continue withdrawing into the interior. On July 1, 1945, the campaign reached its peak at Balik Papan, the largest of the Oboe landings and the final major Australian ground operation of the war. The assault force totaled about 33,000 personnel, built around Major General Edward Milford's Australian 7th Division, with the 18th, 21st, and 25th Infantry Brigades, supported by tanks, engineers, and extensive naval and air components. A small Netherlands East Indies KNIL contingent was attached for reconnaissance and local support. The invasion fleet was on the order of 100 ships, reflecting the scale of lift, escort, minesweeping, and gunfire support needed for a contested landing on a coast, protected by batteries, obstacles, and defended approaches. The opening blow was deliberately weighted toward fire preparation. In the days and hours before H hour, Allied aircraft and naval guns struck coastal positions, suspected headquarters and communications sites, and key routes that could move defenders into the landing area. Minesweeping and hydrographic work were critical enablers. Planners could not risk congestion or ship losses in the narrow approaches to Balik Papan Bay, and the landing schedule depended on keeping channels open for follow-on waves carrying artillery, bulldozers, bridging stores, fuel, and medical facilities. Japanese defenders at Balikpapan were fewer in combat strength than the attackers, but not negligible in the complexity of their defensive problem. Total Japanese strength in the wider area is commonly given as roughly 8,400 to 10,000 personnel, though only about 3,100 to 3,900 were frontline combatants, with additional armed labor and service elements present. Their command structure had to defend a coastline, a port, oil infrastructure, and 2 airfields, while accepting that Allied naval gunfire and air power could disrupt any attempt to mass forces in daylight. As at Tarakan and Brunei Bay, the defensive logic favored prepared positions, local counterattacks, and delaying actions tied to roads and ridges rather than a single decisive stand at the shoreline. The landings went in a few miles north of Balikpapan. Unlike earlier Oboe assaults, the first inland advances met more continuous resistance as Australian units tried to expand the perimeter beyond immediate artillery range of the beaches and open routes for vehicles. The terrain shaped the fight into a sequence of controlled pushes along the limited road net. 2 main axes became defining: the inland and northeastern route that Australian troops labeled the Milford Highway, and the coastal and southern route labeled the Vasey Highway. Movement away from these corridors was restricted by dense vegetation, streams, and the practical limits of carrying ammunition and water in a hot, wet environment. The first week after July 1st was characterized by methodical clearance of strong points that could not be left behind because they overlooked roads, bridges, or unloading areas. Engineers worked under fire to improve crossings and widen tracks for tanks and supply vehicles. Where Japanese coastal guns or bunkers survived the initial bombardment, they became local tactical crises. Assaults had to be reorganized around heavy fire support, flank security, and the slow reduction of fortified positions. This tempo produced a pattern of daily engagements rather than one continuous battle line, with brigades alternating between advancing, consolidating, and clearing bypassed pockets. Operational objectives were pursued in parallel rather than in sequence. One set was logistical: secure the town, port facilities, and usable beaches so the flow of ammunition, fuel, and replacements could continue without interruption. Another was operational: capture the 2 nearby airfields at Sepinggang and Mangar to tighten local air support and reduce dependence on distant bases. A third was strategic and economic: seize oil installations and associated infrastructure, which were subject to sabotage and destruction in the fighting and withdrawal. Civilian life in and around Balikpapan was affected by bombardment, the movement of forces through settled areas, and the disruption of food and medical supply, with the additional complication that industrial zones and port districts were central military objectives. By about 21st July, major combat operations were effectively concluded, though contacts and clearance continued into August as small groups remained in the interior and along routes. The battle's recorded costs to the assaulting force included 229 Australians killed and 634 wounded. Japanese losses in the Balik Papan area are generally reported in the low thousands killed, with only limited numbers captured. The peak phase thus combined maximum fire support, an amphibious scale with a ground fight that remained fundamentally shaped by terrain, engineering capacity, and the time required to dismantle dispersed defenses, while simultaneously building a functioning port and operational airfield system. After the initial seizure of Balikpapan's beachhead in early July 1945, both sides adjusted to a campaign that no longer depended on the landing itself, but on sustaining combat power in an environment that limited speed and observation. Australian operations increasingly became a sequence of clearance tasks along two main supply corridors, while Japanese forces shifted toward dispersed resistance, local counterattacks, and withdrawal into terrain that reduced the effectiveness of Allied firepower. On the Allied side, adaptation centered on integrating engineers, armor, and artillery into daily movement. Because the road network was narrow and vulnerable to mines and ambushes, Australian infantry advances were often paced by engineers clearing obstacles and repairing crossings. Matilda tanks and other armored vehicles were used where ground conditions allowed, not as breakthrough instruments but as close support for reducing bunkers and strong points that were difficult to approach under small arms fire. Artillery and mortars provided predictable fire plans, including concentrations on suspected withdrawal routes and known defensive nodes, with forward observers advancing to positions where lines of sight could be established in dense vegetation. Japanese resistance methods reflected both doctrine and constraint, with limited ability to replace losses or shift units rapidly under Allied air and naval observation. Japanese commanders relied on prepared positions tied to ridgelines, road bends, and streams, and used mines, booby traps, and concealment to create repeated delays. When counterattacks were attempted, they were typically small and localized, aimed at disrupting supply movement, hitting isolated platoons, or forcing Australian units to halt and reorganize rather than at retaking the beachhead. Night movement remained important, both to avoid air attack and to reposition survivors between defensive pockets. A parallel adaptation occurred in logistics. As the perimeter expanded, the volume of supply required increased, and the distance from beach dumps to frontline units lengthened. Water, ammunition, medical evacuation, and road maintenance became determinants of operational tempo. Australian commanders adjusted by improving road surfaces, expanding traffic control, and creating forward supply points. Medical units had to handle casualties over routes that could be interrupted by weather and by intermittent Japanese fire, and engineers prioritized bridging and drainage to reduce the risk that rain would immobilize vehicles. Psychological and morale factors also shifted with the nature of the fighting. For Australian troops, the post-landing phase combined short, intense actions, with long periods of patrol and clearance in limited visibility, where casualties could occur from mines or concealed firing points. For Japanese soldiers, the same phase emphasized survival with diminishing supplies, increasing isolation, and limited options for coordinated maneuver. The operational experience on both sides was shaped by uncertainty. Defenders could not be sure which pockets would be assaulted next, and attackers could not assume that grounds secured would remain safe from infiltration until cleared thoroughly. Beyond Balik Papan, similar patterns were visible in northern Borneo after Oboe 6. Once Brunei Bay and the main coastal towns were taken, Australian units conducted further sweeps toward interior lines and along the coast, while Japanese forces withdrew in small groups toward less accessible areas. These operations often depended on small craft movement along rivers and coastal inlets, and on local intelligence about tracks and settlements. The distinction between combat operations and stabilization blurred. Units simultaneously fought remaining pockets, guarded supply and base construction sites, and supported civil affairs tasks. In the civilian sphere, adaptation meant coping with abrupt changes in authority and practical conditions. The re-establishment of Dutch and local administrative structures was uneven and depended on security, transport, and the availability of personnel. Many civilians faced immediate needs for food and medical care, and the concentration of military effort around ports, airfields, and oil sites disrupted local labor patterns and movement. For some communities, contact with Allied forces brought access to relief and medical services. For others, the immediate impact was displacement from areas under bombardment or near defensive positions. By late July and August 1945, resistance on Borneo was increasingly fragmented. Australian forces shifted further toward area security, base development, and the management of prisoners and displaced persons, while Japanese groups attempted to avoid capture and maintain cohesion in small bands. In this phase, the campaign's character was defined by adaptation rather than escalation. The main question was not how to force a landing, but how to reduce remaining resistance and stabilize key sites with the least operational disruption, while the wider war approached its conclusion, and the strategic value of additional territorial gains was being reassessed in real time. The turning point for the Borneo campaign was not a single tactical battle on the island, but a strategic shift outside it that changed the meaning of continued operations. By July 1945, the last oboe landing at Balik Papan had already taken place, and the remaining tasks on Borneo were clearance, base development, and the restoration of port and airfield functions. At the same time, the wider Pacific War entered its final phase. Japan's capacity to reinforce isolated garrisons continued to contract, and Allied planning increasingly focused on compelling surrender rather than on further amphibious advances in the Netherlands East Indies. On the ground, the turning point appeared first as a reduction in the likelihood of major Japanese counteraction. After the initial weeks at Balik Papan, Japanese forces in the area had been broken into separated pockets with limited communications and increasingly short supplies. Defensive action became more local, designed to delay and inflict losses rather than to protect the oil complex or the town indefinitely. Australian commanders responded by prioritizing systematic clearance. Patrols fixed the location of strong points, artillery and tanks reduced them, and engineers cleared mines and obstacles to keep the supply routes open. This approach accepted that time, rather than maneuver, would resolve the remaining resistance. The second and more decisive turning point came in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th of August, and the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan on the 8th of August, Japan's strategic position changed rapidly. On the 15th of August 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's acceptance of surrender terms, and formal surrender followed on the 2nd of September 1945. For Japanese forces on Borneo, these events transformed the operational situation. Units that had expected a continuation of ground fighting now faced orders to cease hostilities, maintain discipline, and prepare for disarmament and repatriation under Allied supervision. In the Borneo theaters, the transition from combat to compliance was uneven in timing and clarity, reflecting the realities of communications and dispersed forces. Some Japanese commanders received and implemented orders quickly. Others were isolated or reluctant to act without direct confirmation. For Australian units, the immediate task shifted from offensive clearance to verification, establishing contact, arranging formal surrender procedures, collecting weapons, and preventing unauthorized violence during the handover. Patrols that had been searching for enemy positions now moved to confirm ceasefire compliance and identify groups that had not yet received instructions. The turning point also altered civilian realities. As fighting stopped, displaced people began returning toward towns, and food distribution routes reopened gradually. But the end of combat did not remove immediate scarcity or infrastructure damage. The status of prisoners of war and forced laborers became urgent as Allied forces moved to locate camps, provide medical care, and document conditions. In areas around oil installations and ports, Allied priorities emphasized security and controlled access to prevent sabotage or looting, while local administrations attempted to resume basic governance under the shadow of wartime disruption. At a strategic level, the surrender removed the rationale for any further oboe-style operations and confirmed that Borneo would not serve as a springboard for a larger Java invasion. The amphibious resources used in July were no longer needed for additional assaults, and the campaign's final stage became administrative. Demobilization, occupation duties, and the management of the transition from Japanese wartime control to post-war authority in the Netherlands East Indies. For Australian forces, the turning point brought an immediate shift in mission, from combat operations to stabilizing occupied areas and processing surrender, while political authorities prepared for broader post-war negotiations that would reshape sovereignty in the region beyond the battlefield. Outcomes 1945. In the final weeks of August 1945, combat operations on Borneo ended not through a local battlefield collapse, but through the implementation of Japan's surrender across widely dispersed garrisons. For Australian units at Balik Papan, Brunei Bay, and Tarakan, the immediate transition required disciplined control of contact zones, clear procedures for disarmament, and the rapid shift of resources from offensive tasks to occupation and humanitarian responsibilities. Japanese commanders, receiving orders through disrupted communications, were required to cease hostilities, concentrate forces where directed, and surrender weapons and equipment to Allied authorities. At Balik Papan, Australian forces expanded security around the port, oil installations, and airfields as the practical centers of power and logistics. Units that had been conducting patrols and bunker reduction now established collection points for surrendered personnel and weapons. Disarmament was not a single event, but a process. Identifying Japanese units still in the field, confirming chain of command, registering officers and enlisted men, and securing heavy weapons, ammunition dumps, and demolition stores. The risk in this phase was less organized resistance than confusion, unauthorized actions by small groups, or accidents involving mines and ammunition left in place from the fighting. On Tarakan and in northern Borneo, similar patterns followed. Japanese forces, many already fragmented by earlier fighting and retreats, were gathered into controlled areas for processing. For some groups, the transition was straightforward. For others, especially those deeper inland, contact took days or weeks and depended on patrols, local intermediaries, and the gradual restoration of transport routes. Allied commands treated the surrender as both a security task and a logistical task, moving thousands of prisoners, feeding them, preventing disease outbreaks, and ensuring that weapons were removed from circulation. The immediate aftermath for civilians was shaped by the physical condition of towns and the disruption of the local economy. Port areas had been bombarded and mined, roads were damaged or impassable in wet ground, and many communities had limited access to food stocks, medicine, and clean water. Australian and Allied medical services had to manage casualties from the final weeks of combat, alongside civilians suffering from malnutrition and untreated illness. Public health tasks included restoring basic sanitation, preventing outbreaks in crowded areas, and organizing medical triage in places where hospitals and clinics had been degraded during the occupation. Prisoners of war and forced laborers became a central focus of post-combat operations. Allied forces moved to locate camps and work sites, provide emergency food and treatment, and arrange evacuation. The urgency was practical rather than symbolic. Many individuals required immediate medical care, and the logistics of moving them safely depended on control of ports, the availability of ships and aircraft, and the stabilization of local security. Documentation and reporting followed, but the first requirement was survival and transport. Economic and infrastructure consequences were also immediate. Oil facilities at Tarakan and Balik Papan had been targeted and were subject to demolition and damage. Port machinery and storage areas were degraded, and airfields required ongoing engineering work to become reliably usable. Allied authorities had to decide what could be repaired quickly for operational needs and what would be left for later reconstruction. These decisions were influenced by the short horizon created by the war's end, and by the uncertainty of post-war political control. Occupation responsibilities then intersected with emerging political conflict. Dutch-linked administrative structures reappeared in areas of the Netherlands East Indies, but local political movements, influenced by the broader Indonesian Independence Declaration on the 17th of August 1945, began pressing claims that conflicted with restoration plans. On Borneo, this created a tense environment in which Allied military forces aimed to maintain order, and manage surrender logistics, while larger political outcomes were being contested beyond the immediate authority of local commanders. By September 1945, the campaign's final stage was defined by withdrawal and transfer rather than continued fighting. Australian forces began planning redeployment and demobilization, though occupation duties continued while Japanese personnel were processed for repatriation. The end of combat thus produced a layered aftermath, a rapid military transition from assault to control, a humanitarian effort to stabilize civilians and liberated prisoners, and an unresolved political landscape in which the military outcomes of Oboe did not determine the final governance of Borneo and the wider archipelago. Operation Oboe's legacy is defined by the relationship between its tactical outcomes on Borneo and its debated strategic value within the final months of the Pacific War. Militarily, the campaign succeeded in its immediate objectives. Australian-led forces captured Tarakan, secured Brunei Bay and adjacent areas, and took Balik Papan through large amphibious assaults conducted between May 1st and July 1st, 1945. Japanese garrisons on and near the objectives were eliminated as organized forces in those areas, or disarmed after August 1945, and Allied control of key ports, airfields, and coastal nodes was established before the formal end of the war. At the same time, the campaign's significance is often assessed through the timing of results against the war's conclusion. Tarakan was intended to provide an operational airfield quickly, yet repair delays reduced its value for subsequent operations. Brunei Bay did become a major anchorage and base area, but its development occurred as Japan's strategic position was already collapsing under broader pressures. Balik Papan, the largest landing, secured a major oil complex and port, but it occurred 1 month before Japan's surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, limiting the extent to which these gains could influence subsequent major operations. For Australia, Oboe has long been linked to questions of national contribution and post-war influence. The campaign provided a large, defined combat role for Australian ground forces after earlier fighting in New Guinea, and at a time when many Allied operations were increasingly American-led. Australian casualties illustrate the scale of that role. At Balik Papan, 229 were killed and 634 wounded. At Labuan, within Oboe, 634 were killed and 93 wounded. At Beaufort, 7 were killed and 38 wounded. These figures, combined with Tarakan losses and the broader wounded totals, anchor the campaign in the human costs borne by a force operating under coalition command and strategic constraints. For Japan, Oboe is part of the wider pattern of 1945. Increasingly isolated garrisons required to defend multiple objectives with reduced mobility, limited air support, and shrinking supply. Japanese defensive choices on Borneo were consistent with late-war practice across the region: preserve forces by avoiding decisive beach battles where possible, shift resistance inland to delay advances, and use mines and prepared positions to impose time costs. The results reflected the imbalance of resources in mid-1945. Japanese losses at Balik Papan were in the low thousands killed with limited captures. At Labuan, 389 were recorded killed and 11 captured. At Beaufort, about 93 were assessed killed and 2 captured. The pattern of relatively few prisoners in several engagements reflected both combat conditions and the limited opportunities for organized surrender before August. For civilians, the legacy is harder to reduce to operational measures. Borneo's population experienced 3 linked transitions: years of occupation and scarcity, months of bombardment and ground fighting around ports and airfields, and then an abrupt shift to surrender administration and post-war uncertainty. Immediate post-combat priorities included medical relief, food distribution, and the recovery of prisoners of war and forced laborers. The longer-term political environment was shaped by the larger crisis of sovereignty in the Netherlands East Indies after 1945, meaning that local outcomes on Borneo became part of a contested transition rather than a simple restoration of pre-war governance. Historically, Oboe is often discussed through competing frameworks. One view emphasizes the competence of late-war amphibious execution. the ability of Australian formations to plan and conduct complex assaults with just strong naval and air integration, and the practical capture of oil and port infrastructure. Another view focuses on opportunity cost, the commitment of large amphibious resources and the human losses for objectives whose strategic payoff was reduced by the timing of Japan's surrender and by the cancellation of larger follow-on plans such as a Java invasion. Both interpretations rest on the same facts. Oboe was operationally successful at the tactical level, while its strategic necessity remains dependent on how one weighs alliance politics, resource objectives, and the rapidly shifting endgame of the Pacific War. In commemoration, Oboe occupies a distinct place in Australian military memory as the final major combat deployment of the 2nd Australian Imperial Force and the last large amphibious operations conducted by Australian divisions in the Second World War. In Japanese military history, it appears as one more late-war defense conducted under strategic isolation, similar in character to other perimeter battles in 1944 to 1945. For Borneo and the wider region, it represents a short but decisive military episode that did not settle the political future, but did alter the immediate balance of control and the conditions under which the post-war transition unfolded.